us to grow closer to you, help us to learn more of your word today, and help us grow closer to each other. I pray all this in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so this week, this is the halfway point. After today, we are halfway done with the class, and that's good. So this week, we're on the fifth commandment, halfway through, honor thy father and thy mother. So briefly looking at this, we've got just the first five will be ended today, and then we'll continue on with the last five, and we're going to see that there's a division here at the fifth. So it's a good thing this is the halfway point. So let's go right to the text of the command. So Exodus 20, verse 12. It says, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. So pretty simple. Here's the command itself. And we're going to notice things here that today we're going to see a shift in focus of these commands. So we should notice that this command is different than the first four we looked at. The first four were very heavily focused on our relationship with God. And so the first one was, thou shalt have no other gods before me. The second one was idolatry, then taking God's name in vain, and the Sabbath. And we saw that those very obviously and very directly pointed to God in a very strong, easily observed manner. This command seems to shift a little bit away from that, although it's not really. It still has God in mind, and it still is similar in that way that it's the way we respect our parents obviously reflects well on our Heavenly Father. But this is a point where we see a shift between now we have duties not just to God, but also to man. And that's going to continue throughout the commandments. So it's an interesting command, I think, because it works to, in some ways, put an end cap to the first five. So it's grouped well with the first five because the way we honor our parents reflects on God in the same way that we honor God from the first commandment. So it's kind of an end cap to these first five. And then much later in our class in week 13, 14, 15, we're going to see that there's a natural division in these commands, the first five and the last five. But we're not going to develop that today. So we're just going to see that it's a shifting of the focus. It's kind of a bridge between our duties to God and our duties to man. So what does this command mean? We're going to look at three different things. First, honoring your parents, the very obvious and easy part of the command. We're going to see that the command also involves loving others and not just your parents, even though that's not very obvious from the text. Then we're going to see that there's a blessing. And we're going to kind of look at the blessing that's associated directly with this command. And it's the only command with a blessing, which is interesting. All right, so let's look at the first aspect of this command. Honor your father and your mother, directly from the text. Honor thy father and thy mother, that the days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. So kind of a definition. What does this mean? To give, to give proper respect, deference, love, and fear to your mother and your father. So the Hebrew behind the word here, honor, is interesting. It has the idea of weightiness or significance. It's not just that you bow down and worship them, that kind of honor. It's you give more significance, you give more emphasis on their wishes and their desires and their actions. They should have a special place in your life that no one else inhabits. If they make a request and someone else makes a request, you give them more weight, you give their request more force. That's what the word honor means here. Interestingly, the Hebrew word for curse, which is kind of the opposite of this, has exactly the opposite meaning, in that it has the idea of lightness, insignificance, or a small thing. So for example, in Exodus 21:17, right after the giving of the commandment, we have this verse, and he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. So this verse is not telling us that the child must make a verbal curse. It's not that they use a special word, or they say a thing, or they say I hate you, or if they're witches, or in these days witches, and they made curses on your parents. It's not that kind of curse. It's to treat them lightly. It's the opposite idea of honoring. You treat them with lightness or flippantly. You treat them as if they're someone else or even less than other people. That's the idea of cursing your parents. So it's the opposite of honor. So understanding this command, it's giving respect and The opposite would be true. If you take away respect from them or you treat them without respect, that's what the idea of cursing is. So it's interesting that it says they are worthy of death in that case. So God takes this very seriously. I think no one in modern times takes this seriously at all. But in Exodus 21:17, he says, you put them to death if they curse their parents, if they treat them lightly, if they don't honor them with the proper respect. So it's a very important commandment that has, that at least in the Old Testament, God was very serious about. And that should give us a little perspective on how seriously we should take this. So just to kind of wrap it up, our parents occupy a special and unique place in our lives, and it's not just because of the biological facts of human reproduction. Yes, you did need a father and a mother to create you, but it's not just that for that simple biological fact we should honor them. We should honor them for a spiritual reason, but biology, I think, interestingly, points us to that spiritual reason. It is necessary for us to have parents, and God says you should honor them. So God intended every child to have both a father and a mother, and those children are to give their parents proper respect. So what do we mean honor? That's kind of the weightiness, but what about obedience? So honor does not necessarily mean obedience. It means just treat them with special respect and weightiness. However, obedience is clearly commanded to children in Ephesians 6:1-4, which says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. This is every parent's favorite verse. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So clearly our obedience to our parents is subject to God's commands. We understand that. However, it is clear that the parents have wide latitude in the control they are given over their children. So we're going to see later on that the parents' duty to the children is important, where they have the requirement to not provoke them to anger, and they must make their commands in line with Scripture. They must be biblical commands. But besides that, we as parents have wide latitude in how we raise our children, and how much authority we have over them is very unrestricted. As long as your command is not anti-biblical, as long as your command doesn't go against God's will, you are allowed to make that command, and the children must follow them. So it's a very broad authority that parents have over the children. Later on, we're going to see that the government has authority over us also, which is correct, but their authority is much narrower. But yet, there's two places in the Bible where it says give honor. There's several places, but at least two places where we're supposed to give honor, and one is to our parents and one is to our government officials. So it's interesting that this honor is tied to authority. And I don't develop that too much here, but whenever you see honor, you should see that there's some authority usually in the context of that honor, and that's a key indicator that there's a hierarchy. There's something there that you should pay attention to. If you are honoring someone, their commands have weight, and those weighty commands should be obeyed unless you have a good reason not to, a biblical reason not to. So obedience, not necessarily required by the command, but the honor is. And if you're a child under the authority of your parents, you do have to obey them as an extension of the command. So then the natural question kind of comes up, what about as an adult? So I'm an adult, I have my own kids. Do I still obey my father? Do I still honor them? Well, honoring has no restrictions or limitations on this command. Honor does not stop when you move out, when you get married, when you become independent, or even when your parents die. Obedience obviously has a limit. If they're dead, you can't obey them, obviously, but honor does not. Obedience does end when you leave your parents, as the Bible says, when you leave your father and mother and cleave to your wife. That's when your obedience to them ends, but the honor does not. There is no limitation to when you stop honoring your parents. So for example, if my dad just says, hey, stop talking, come down here and talk to me, I would probably go down there and talk to him and obey him. But if any other random person, if Mark said, hey, come down here, I need to tell you something, I'd probably say, hey, let's wait till after class. because it's not necessarily because I must obey him, but because his word has a weightier significance to me than anyone else does, simply because he's my father. And it would be honoring of the commandment to honor him in that way. This is necessary for our morality. This is proper, and this is good. But it doesn't mean slavish obedience. If he said, do something evil, I would not do it, obviously. So for a biblical example of this, let's turn to Genesis 50, and we'll see how Joseph treated his father. All right, I'm actually going to start in Genesis 49, verse 33, and we're going to read 50:12. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed, and yielded up the ghost, and was gathered unto his people. And Joseph fell upon his father's face, and wept upon him, and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. And when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spake unto the house of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Lo, I die in my grave, which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan, there shall thou bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come again. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury thy father, according as he had made thee swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. And all the house of Joseph, and his brethren, and his father's house, only their little ones, and their flocks, and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan. And there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians. Wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. All right, so after his father's death, Joseph carried out his dying wishes and gave him a respectful and honorable burial. And this was a testimony to the Egyptians and the Canaanites who saw it. So Jacob's dying wish, essentially, or I guess Isaac's dying wish, was that he be buried with his parents. No, this is Jacob. Why did I read Isaac? So Joseph honored his father's wishes by burying him in the threshing floor where he wanted to be buried with his father Abraham and Isaac. And this was a good thing. This was honoring his parent, even though his parent wasn't around to be honored. Was he honoring the dead? Yeah, in some way he was. And there's nothing wrong with that. He's honoring his parent. He's not worshiping him, like it goes too far in some cases, but he is honoring his last wishes. This was a good thing. And it was not just a good thing in general for them. It was a testimony to the Egyptians and the Canaanites. The Canaanites saw this large train of people coming down to bury their founding father, essentially. And they said, this is a marvelous thing. They really respected this person. They honored this person. He must have been someone very special to them. And who was he to them? He was just their father. And so that's good. That is an honorable thing to do to your parents. Joseph fulfilled this command. Interestingly, there was no command at this time, but he still fulfilled this. So this is a pre-commandment fulfillment of the command, which is, you'll find this throughout the Bible. In fact, that these commands are universal, as we talked about in some of the first classes. These commandments are universal, and they applied even before they were written down. So then another obvious question comes up. What about bad parents? So again, there is no restriction on honoring them. However, this does not mean that you ignore their faults or treat them with undue reverence. They should still inhabit a special place in your life despite their faults. So you don't ignore their evil deeds. There's your meme for the day. You don't ignore their evil deeds. You don't obey them slavishly, but you still give them some amount of honor. And this is good. This might, in fact, help them to come to Christ. So in the last last time I taught this class, one of the students said that their father treated them poorly, but essentially through their witnessing to their father got saved. So that's the ultimate honoring of your parents, is to lead them to Christ. And it's very hard to do that if you dishonor your parents, while even if they are bad to you, if you are honoring your parents, it puts a burden on them to say, there's something more to this than simply, they're not faking their religion. There is something to this religion. I've abused my children, I've been bad to them, and yet they are good to me. That's a very Christ-like thing to do. So for kind of an example of this, all the adults who directly received this command from Moses in Exodus 20, they were at that very moment worshiping a golden calf. As God was writing down, honor thy father and the mother, all the fathers and mother in Israel were worshiping a golden calf and dancing around naked and being terrible people. Yet this command was given to them and their children. Honor your parents, even though I know your parents are evil, very wicked, and it was very hard for Moses to even find one good person in all of Israel. In fact, all the parents who were receiving this command were cursed to die in the wilderness within 40 years. So they were not good people. And yet the children of those people were told to honor those not good people, those very evil people, in fact. The people who constantly griped and groaned to Moses about all the things that they were given in the wilderness and all the manna. Those people still deserved honor from their children. You should treat your parents, even the bad ones, with more respect than you would any other person. So, for example, if an acquaintance of yours is constantly rude to you, it would be perfectly acceptable for you to just sever ties with them. Just say, you're an awful person, goodbye. Don't say you're an awful person, but just leave them. Just sever ties, don't talk to them again, just ignore them. They're essentially nothing to you anymore. That's perfectly acceptable for you to do that to a stranger or an acquaintance. But that's not acceptable to do that with your parents. If your parent is always rude to you, you should not have the same reaction as you would to any random stranger. You should try to work through their mistreatment and mend the relationship, even if it's painful for you. And thankfully, God understands that it's very painful for you and it's not easy and it's not good, so he gives you a blessing on top of this, which definitely helps us honor our parents, even the worst of parents. But we're going to talk about the blessing later. But the idea is still the same. God doesn't qualify who you honor except to say that it's your parents. If they are your parents, you honor them, even if they're awful people, even if they're very evil people. So, all right, here's a question. What about orphans or those with adopted parents? So this was a good question from last trimester. What do you do if you have no parents? So the command does not say, if you have parents, honor them. It says, you have parents, honor them. We all have or had parents. There was a man and there was a woman, and then you came. You didn't just spontaneously come about. I guess you weren't Adam, right? It is our duty to honor our parents, even if we don't know them. So here's an interesting thought experiment. How do you honor a parent who you don't know? So my great-grandmother, when she was born, she was essentially put up for adoption. She was left at a fire station, right? Fire station? We don't know. We don't know where she was left because it was so long ago. But she was, her parents, we don't know who they were. She was essentially given up for adoption. So her adopted parents became her parents. Does she still have a duty to honor her birth parents? Yes. How does she do that if she doesn't know who they are? You can give the same respect to them somewhat in absence. So here's a good idea. Don't talk evil of your biological parents, even if you don't know them, or even if you do know them and they're awful people. Don't talk evil of them. Give them honor and respect because they are your parents. That also means you give honor and respect to your adopted parents, since they are now your parents. So you essentially have two sets of parents. You have four parents in some way that you must honor and respect through this commandment. So kind of an example, the patriarchs, so that's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 children of Jacob, they were all honored for millennia throughout Israel. even if some of them were not related to any of the Israelites, say in Jesus' day. If you had a proselyte come in, he might be just very barely related to any of the patriarchs, and yet they are still given honor. The patriarchs were dead for millennia by the time Jesus came around, and yet even Jesus honors them. He constantly says, I am the God of your father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He uses their the weighty honor that the Jews gave to them. He uses them as a way to persuade the Jews of the day to follow him, because they honored their forebears, their patriarchs, and this was a good thing for them to do. So even if you've never met your biological parents, you can still honor them. You do this by avoiding speaking ill of them or being bitter for them for giving you up for adoption or what have you. So quell that bitterness, which may be natural if you are given up for adoption. That can ruin your life, and try not to be bitter about that. Try to still give your biological parents honor, even if it's difficult to do. So, and also extend that honor to your adopted parents. You must treat them as if they were your biological parents. So don't forget that Jesus teaches that we are his adopted children. So in Romans 8:15 and 16, it says this, "For ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but ye have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father, the Spirit itself bearing witness with our spirit that we are the children of God." So it's a parallel idea that we are God's adopted children. He's our adopted Father. We are to cry, Abba, Father, to him. We are to give him honor and respect as our adopted parent. Kind of an interesting thought, though. If we are adopted into God's family, weren't we children of the devil before? Should we honor the devil? No. It's not the same type of thing. But the Bible does say don't bring any railing accusations against the devil. So actually, yes, if the devil says a thing, you should give his words weight too, because he's the devil, and it's a very scary thing to hear the words of the devil. But anyway, so let's look at some examples. First of all, Joseph, we looked at that one earlier. We're not going to rehash that one, but Jesus, he's a good example of how to treat your parents. So let's look at Luke 2. Obviously, Jesus is the best example of pretty much everything in Scripture. So let's look at Jesus' early life. This is this is probably the only text about beyond Jesus' birth. We know nothing about him until he starts his ministry, except what's found here in Luke 2. So Luke 2:41 to 52 says, "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother knew not of it. But they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance. And when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem, seeking him. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. And he said unto them, How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my father's business? And they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was subject unto them. But his mother kept all these sayings in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man." All right, so this was kind of the situation. In this case, Jesus was seemingly a pretty independent 12-year-old and liked to have deep theological discussions in the temple. I don't know how he did this. This was he must have been quite the independent kid. I bet it was also somewhat, it seemed somewhat cultural that everyone's going to go down there in mass. Everyone's going to come up here in mass. We're not going to keep track of the kids so much, which seems bizarre to me. I can't turn around for 5 minutes and not worry that my kids are getting into some kind of trouble. But Jesus was a good kid, obviously, and this is the case. He had deep theological discussions, but if you see, he was asking them questions and answering their questions. It sounds like it was a very respectful thing. He wasn't berating them with doctrine, which wouldn't necessarily have been wrong either, but he wasn't. He seemed respectful of them. He listened to their questions, he listened to them as they spoke, and he answered them and asked them questions. It was a dialogue, and it was honoring them. But then when his parents came, he was subject to them, thereby giving them honor. And after this incident, he grew in stature with God and men. And how did he grow in stature? Both by the questions and answers, the deep theological truths that he would say, and the amazing feat it was for a 12-year-old to do this, but also in the way that he was subject to his parents. Even though in some ways he had double duty. He was honoring his heavenly Father by being in the temple and teaching the doctors in that case, but also he was honoring his parents by being subject to them when they told him to come back. So this happens again, not this same thing, but we see Jesus again as a good example at the crucifixion. So in John, you don't have to turn there, John 19:26 through 27 says, "When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by him who he loved, he said unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Then saith he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her unto his own home." So Jesus is saying, Mary, John is now essentially your child. John, please take care of Mary in my absence. So we see that Jesus was not able to fulfill his responsibility to care for his mother, since it seems that Joseph was not in the picture for unknown reasons that people love to speculate about, but I don't care to speculate. The simple fact is that Joseph wasn't there, and since Joseph wasn't there, the responsibility falls to the eldest child, the eldest son, to take care of the mother. So in this case, Jesus couldn't do that because he was literally going to die. So he says, John, take care of my mother in my absence, thereby fulfilling his responsibilities to his parent, which is an honorable thing to do. He's honoring his parent even in his dying moment. So Jesus honors Mary by giving her into the care of John, his disciple, in his absence. And people like to speculate, why didn't he give it to any of his other brothers? I don't know, but at least part of the answer I would give would be none of his other brothers believed in him. So he would give his mother to the disciple, one of the only disciples who was there at the crucifixion, who believed in him. And I think that's a good thing to do, even though he did have brothers that he could have committed her, that the responsibility could have fallen to them. So Jesus very, very well in two different places at two different times fulfills the commandment, honor your parents, and we should take him as a good example. So let's look at the second aspect of this command, loving others and not just your parents. So where does this come from? This comes from Leviticus 19:18. So the command in Exodus 20 seems limited to only parents, but if you turn to Leviticus 19, and do turn there, we're going to read a bunch of this. So in Leviticus 19, to get a deeper understanding of the command and its application, this chapter deals with many practical and general rules that should govern our behavior. Some of the rules in this chapter only apply to the Jews, and that's obvious by their ceremonial significance. A lot of it deals with sacrifices and whatnot, but a lot of the commandments here are general rules. They deal with the Ten Commandments, and therefore they apply to us. They're broadly applicable. The chapter starts with the first 4 verses reiterating the first 5 commandments to give the purpose and the context of the following commands. Let me read that to you, Leviticus 19, 1 through 4. "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say unto them, Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Ye shall fear every man his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Turn ye not unto idols, nor make to yourselves molten gods. I am the Lord your God." So it kind of sets up the context. He's speaking of the Ten Commandments. He's speaking of general morality to the people of Israel. So then later in the chapter, we read that these commands are broadened in various ways, and then generally summarized in verse 18 with, "Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord." And then later in verse 32, we read that this concept is expanded even more. "Thou shalt rise up before the hoary head, and honor the face of the old man, and fear thy God. I am the Lord." So the definition of this kind of what does love others mean is, very simply put, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Simply put, but very hard to do. So this is why Jesus reiterates this in the New Testament. He says the two commands, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. It comes from this command. And it comes from the Old Testament also. It's not just a New Testament recreation of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are universally applicable to everyone for all time, including the New Testament and the Old Testament and before they were given. And so when Jesus says it in the New Testament, to love thy neighbor as thyself, he's quoting here Leviticus 19. He's not inventing something they didn't already know. So let's go through this. Love others. So this is broad and inclusive. In Leviticus 19, you could read that the Jews were told to include strangers who were Gentiles living with the Jews and were not related to them in any way. So it's not just a family bond, as the command seems to be in Exodus 20. It's not just love your parents because blood relation or something like that. No, it expands to include everyone. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Love the strangers who are in the land, who have no part of your blessings or promises. Love them too. In Luke 10, Jesus gives the parable of the Good Samaritan to help clarify that our neighbors are not just people who we know and care about. They include random strangers, and in some cases, people you despise, people you hate, people who were even your enemies in some cases, which is where the New Testament command of love thy enemies comes from. It's a natural extension of this command. Even though it might seem like a little bit of a stretch to get there, it really isn't. So what else does this mean? We should honor elders in society. So this comes from Leviticus 19. You're still there. Verse 32 says, thou shalt rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man and fear thy God. I am the Lord. So this is more broad than just your parents or grandparents. This is generally speaking about the elders within all of your society. This is practically advantageous since a large amount of life experience that these elders have should be valued and used to benefit society. But if you remember, our morality is not based on what benefits these commands can give us. It's based on God's example. God is our moral standard. It's also spiritually significant since the elders tend to be one of the most vulnerable and weakest segments of society. So it is good that we take care of our elders in society. It's good that we honor them. It's an extension of this command. Parents and the elders are some of the only people that we are commanded to honor in the whole Bible. I talked about this a little bit. We're going to see that pastors are also told to honor. Elders in the church, same thing. The government, we are supposed to honor and obey. But usually, outside of those groups, I couldn't find anyone else that we are explicitly told to honor except for God. So this is a very special category. People who you are supposed to honor by command is your parents, your pastor, your spiritual leaders, your government, and pretty much no one else. So it's a narrow category. Don't just breeze over that. It's a significant category. So this also implies that we are to honor our heritage, since our heritage was the thing created by those elders who came before us and those elders who we are honoring. It's not enough just to say, oh yes, they were good people. Everything they did was trash, but I honor them somehow. So if we remember the example of Joseph and how he treated his father, Jacob, and buried him according to his wishes, it's interesting. We continue to read from there. So let's go to Genesis 50. Back to Genesis 50. I should have told you to put bookmark there. So if you read Genesis 50, 25 through 26, Joseph is giving instructions about his own body and how it should be handled. So right after he buries his father, he says, now I have instructions for all of you how to handle my bones. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So he says, take my bones. God will deliver you from this. It's a prophecy, actually. God says, you will be delivered. You will carry up my bones from hence. So you will take my bones out of Egypt, essentially. And this is good. And then a few hundred years later, took a while, but a few hundred years later, when the Israelites do leave Egypt in the Exodus story, they bring his bones and bury him according to his request, even though none of them were his children or grandchildren. And interestingly, none of them took that oath. Everyone who took the oath, who said, yes, I swear we will do this thing, all of them died, but they didn't do the thing. Their oath passed on to their children. Their children have to honor the responsibilities and the oaths that their parents take on themselves, which is interesting. Some of them were his direct descendants. So Joseph's children had children and so on for a few hundred years. And yes, those people were directly related to Joseph, but I would imagine some of them were not. But that was enough for them to honor his request. So if you continue reading, we're not going to read it, but you can read in Joshua 24:32 and Exodus 13:19, where they do in fact take his bones up out of Egypt and they do bury them properly according to his wishes, according to the oath that he made their great-great-grandparents make. They do honor his wishes and they show respect to their parents in that way. This serves to demonstrate that the honoring of the elders is not for their benefit. It's a general moral principle that applies even after the elders are dead. So as kind of a modern example, this would be like us preserving the bones of Christopher Columbus for hundreds of years and then burying them according to his dying wish. So if he said, I want to be buried in Italy, or I want to be buried in Italy, it would be like us preserving his bones in the U.S. and then hundreds of years later reverently taking them and burying them in Italy according to his dying wishes. Why would we do that? That would show honor to our ancestors, to our culture, to our elders. So it's not a surprise that we see us doing the opposite in America, where we're tearing down every statue, we're tearing down every reference to any historical figure, and we're rewriting history in terrible ways. This is a direct result of having the Ten Commandments. Our evil sin nature wants to rebel against this. And so what happens? You see the rebellion in the way we treat our heritage. We treat our culture poorly. We treat our elders poorly. We treat our progenitors poorly. Even though I am not related to Columbus that I know of, we should still honor him in a special way because he is our elder in our society. So I think that the modern American sensibility that we are all individual people, we are self-made individuals. Whoever you are, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You don't need the man. You don't need help from anyone. I think that's wrong also. I think that goes too far. It's kind of we have that thought because of the way we rejected the European notion of monarchy and of royal blood and that kind of thing, where they went too far and put too much stock in who your ancestors were. I think we just kind of reflexively went too far, and we should moderate in some way. There's obviously ways you can go too far. So in a lot of East Asian cultures, and actually it's a somewhat, I was looking this up the other day, and ancestor worship is, you generally think of it as an East Asian thing, like the Chinese, the Buddhists or some kind. I'm not sure if the Buddhists do it, but there's lots of it practiced in East Asia. I was looking it up. It's actually somewhat universal. In a lot of pagan cultures everywhere in the world, ancestor worship is a common theme. So they're going too far. They're obviously committing idolatry. In fact, you'll find often little idols of their ancestors. And they'll worship them. They'll make sacrifices to them. They go too far. They commit adultery. They don't put God first in that case. So there's obviously a balance. We should honor our culture. We should honor our elders in our society, but don't go too far. I think the way that the Jews did it was probably fine, and the way that Jesus somewhat confirms is the correct way, where he says, God is constantly reminding them that I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's using the honor they had for them to say, you honor them rightly, I am their God, they honored me, therefore you must honor me also, in kind of two different ways. Honor me because I am your God, and honor me because I was your parents' God. It's an interesting way of fulfilling the first command by also fulfilling the fifth command. And then just kind of as a last point to this, if you don't have a godly heritage, what do you do? That's okay. You should understand that you are now the heritage that you are creating. So you must now create a godly heritage. If you are a saved person, it's obviously your duty to do the right thing, and your children then will have a godly heritage to honor, and that'll be good. So we looked at examples. Joseph, we already went through that. And then honor elders in the church. This is an interesting part of the command. It's alluded to within the context of the New Testament church, which fits into a much broader categorization of the Ten Commandments that we're going to see much later in our classes. But if you notice, the first 5 commandments were very much God-focused, and you would see them repeated in the church. The last 5 are very much man-focused, and you'll see them repeated in government. And so it's an interesting way that there is a natural division between these first 5, and here's where it's found in the church. So those references up there, 1 Timothy 5, 1 through 2, Paul tells the church members to view each other as a family. I'm not going to read it, but that's what it says there. Rebuke not, I guess I'll read it. Rebuke not an elder, but treat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity. You can keep reading. The family unit is to remain intact, obviously, but the church is also to become a second family to us, and this is a way of fulfilling the 5th commandment. So pastors are called elders in the church. So as pastor has been going through the titles and responsibilities of a pastor in the church, one of the titles was elder. It's not a mistake. This is somewhat the reason why. Because our relationship to our parents is one of honor. Our relationship to the pastor or the elder of the church, the elders in the church, is one of honor also. It's a mirror passage. So 1 Timothy 5:17 says, "Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine." So the elders are also to be honored similarly to how our parents are to be honored. And then in 1 Corinthians 4:14 through 16, Paul makes an argument to the church there that they should give his words extra weight as he is dealing with false doctrines in the church, specifically because he was the one who led them to Christ, and therefore some form of spiritual father figure to them. So you can read that verse up there. It's basically, Paul says, you have many teachers, but only one father. And what does he mean by father? He means, I led you to the Lord. And simply by that fact, you should give me, my words, more weight. Simply by the fact that he is their spiritual progenitor in some way. He was the one who led them to Christ. I think we should all have that same attitude. If someone leads you to Christ, you should honor them in some special way. It's a extension of this commandment. All right, so very briefly, let's go through the reward. Here's the reward, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. So what's the definition? Just that. So notice this includes 2 things, long days or long life and prosperity, and the land you inhabit. However, in Ephesians, the land is expanded to include the whole earth, which is perfectly fine. So what is this reward? It's pretty vague, except that it includes things going well and prolonging of days in the earth, which is good. It doesn't mean that you will have a long life. It just says you may. So obviously Jesus fulfilled this properly and died at 33. It's not very long life, but he did have blessings from this. So it's not a definitive thing. It's not very specific. You will have this and this and this, wealth, health, wealth, and prosperity or whatever. It's just things will go well and you may live long on the land. I would argue if you don't honor your parents, you probably won't have any of those things. So general prosperity, you gain wisdom by being guided by experienced people who presumably care for you, which gives you a special blessing from God. I have fact sheets here. I doubt you could read those, but let me read one of these points. Most adolescents who enter the justice system have suffered from parental abandonment, substance abuse, or a dysfunctional household. In a study of 75 juvenile delinquents, 66% experienced fatherlessness, 20% had never lived with their father, and 25% had an alcoholic father. So obviously, there's no real statistics to say you didn't honor your father. How do you even study that? But if you don't have a father, you certainly didn't honor him very well, I don't think. I don't think these children did, and they ended up in prison. Here's the really good bullet points. The second one right over here. Children who feel closeness to their father are 80% less likely to spend time in jail. So how do you explain that? That's a very difficult one. That's clearly part of the blessing. If you want here's a really easy filter. If you don't want your kids to go to prison and you're a father, be close to them, and they are 80% less likely to spend time in jail. That's pretty amazing. This is part of the reward. I'm sure there's other explanations you can have for that, naturalistic explanations, but I say at least part of it is this spiritual blessing. So I would say that there's a opposite side to this. I don't have any time to develop this, but in the Old Testament, it's clear that dishonor carries a curse. You can read Romans 1:28-32, which lists a whole bunch of sins and a progression of sins. One of those sins is disobedience to parents, and it involves lots of other sins. And it's a little shocking to see disobedience to parents in this list. I encourage you to read this. This is the same one, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, all that stuff, and then disobedient to parents. So all these horrible things, and then just, dishonor your parents. It's in there because of this. It's an extension of this command. Dishonor them, and you have a curse. So what about bad parents? This is why. This is a very big help. The reward helps us to honor even the worst of parents. Obviously, we should not follow the bad parents' examples, but God will still bless you for honoring them as best as you can. So it's somewhat of a help. Even if they're evil, it doesn't say that they were, 80% of these children were close to a good parent. They said 80% of them were close to a parent, a father. So wrapping up very quickly, put it into our framework. What does this law teach about God? He has an interest. He has an intended order and hierarchy for us. He gives us God, our parents, and us, and we are to honor that hierarchy. He gives us his authority to human rulers. So we didn't touch much on this, but he gives his authority to us as parents, and then we command our children, and that's going to be a theme going forward. He rewards the honoring of imperfect people. And what does it teach us about us? We have both a father and a mother, obviously, not just by accident of biology. It's an intentional thing. We are made subject to our parents, and that is good. We are adopted into a spiritual family that also requires our honor, and here it is. This spiritual family is the church, at least in part, and we must give special honor to our parents, our elders, and our heritage. So what does it teach us about good and evil? The family unit is more than just a biological fact. It's intentional and purposeful, and we should honor it and keep it in mind. Sin is rebellion against God's prescribed earthly authority, not just his divine authority. So if you're sinning against God, you're probably sinning against your parents, and vice versa. If you're sinning against your parents, you are sinning against God. He has an earthly authority for you to follow. Our love for God and our fellow man is at the root of all sin. It's why Jesus so easily summarized the command as obey God and love man. Love God and love man. So how do we practice this? Or what are the outcomes of this? If we do practice this, we'll have a strong family unit, the nuclear family, which has all its wonderful benefits. We will have a longer and more prosperous life, respect and love for other people, and inherited wisdom from our elders. And how do we do it? Love, respect, and obey your parents, respect the elderly and your heritage, love one another, and love your neighbor. All right, so we have handouts. I think you all might have already got the handouts for next week. So just two questions about, one is about capital punishment. Is capital punishment the correct punishment for premeditated murder today? There are your options. And I do mean, should we have capital punishment as the prescribed punishment for murder today? Not just like, do we do it as America? Go look up our laws and see what we do. No, is it correct for us to have capital punishment at all? And then the other question, here's a more interesting one. Can a person be saved and commit suicide? So these are interesting questions. Think about these for next week, and you're dismissed.